The glimmering lights of Manhattan twinkled like fallen stars on the rain-soaked asphalt. It was Christmas Eve, and along the iconic Fifth Avenue, millionaire Alexander Whitmore was behind the wheel of his newly purchased McLaren Solus GT. The car's engine roared with a power that made the surrounding buildings tremble. As he cruised down the bustling avenue, a silhouette caught his eye. She walked with confidence, dressed in a sleek black skirt that shimmered under the streetlights and heels that echoed against the pavement. This part of the city was known for its share of women offering discreet companionship, and Alexander's brow furrowed in distaste. His grip on the steering wheel tightened as he accelerated slightly, but the deep growl of the McLaren's engine caught her attention. She paused, turning slowly on her high heels to face the sound, her figure illuminated by the soft glow of a nearby lamp post. And in that instant, Alexander's world shifted. It was her, or at least, it looked like her. The woman who had once been his wife, the mother of his twin daughters, the woman who had walked out of his life years ago, taking with her not only his love but also his trust in second chances. Her crimson lips, perfectly lined eyes, and unmistakable contours of her face left him frozen. Time seemed to halt as a single thought struck him like lightning. The past always finds a way to walk among the shadows of the present, no matter how tightly we close the door. Alexander slammed on the brakes, pulling over sharply to the curb. He lowered the tinted window, and the cold December air rushed in, carrying with it the dissonant scent of his confusion. "Get in," he commanded, his voice steadier than he had expected. The woman approached the car with a mischievous smile, blowing a pink bubble of gum that popped noisily as she leaned into the open window. Her perfume, cheap and overpowering, clashed with the refined leather interior of the McLaren. Her gaze lingered on him, arching a brow in amused curiosity. "Handsome," she drawled, her tone laced with mockery. "My time comes with a price tag." "Just get in," Alexander interrupted, his voice clipped, urgent. "I'll pay whatever you want." Her eyebrow arched higher, disbelief mingling with intrigue in her expression. She let out a soft, throaty laugh that revealed her perfectly painted lips. "Well, when you put it that way..." With a deliberate slowness, she opened the door and slipped into the car. The click of her stiletto heels against the floor and the sensual grace of her movements were almost theatrical. The door shut with a soft thud, and the roar of the engine returned as Alexander pulled back into traffic. Inside, the air was thick with tension. The woman toyed idly with a strand of her hair, chewing gum loudly, seemingly unaffected by the intensity that emanated from the man beside her. Alexander kept his gaze fixed on the road, his jaw set, his mind a storm of questions. Was it really her? Or was fate playing some cruel trick on him on this most unlikely of nights? After a long, heavy silence, Alexander spoke, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "What's your name?" he asked, his tone sharp, almost interrogative. The woman glanced at him sideways, her expression a mix of curiosity and amusement. "Why? You planning to write me a love letter?" she teased, popping her gum for effect. Alexander's grip tightened on the wheel. "Your name," he repeated, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. She tilted her head, clearly entertained by his seriousness. "Fine," she said with an exaggerated sigh. "It's Vanessa." "Vanessa what?" he pressed, his dark eyes flickering toward her before returning to the road. She chuckled, shaking her head as though he were the most ridiculous man she'd ever met. "Vanessa. Just Vanessa. Is that not enough for you?" Alexander's expression didn't waver. His jaw clenched as he delivered his next words with the precision of a command. "While you're with me, your name is Madeline." Vanessa raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into a smirk. "Madeline," she repeated, letting the name roll off her tongue like a joke. "What, is that some kind of fantasy of yours?" The corner of Alexander's mouth twitched, but he stayed focused on the road. "That's not your concern," he said firmly. "Just do as you're told." Her smirk deepened, and she let out a low laugh, leaning back against the luxurious leather seat. "All right, boss," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Madeline it is, but for the record, you've got some weird taste in fantasies." Alexander ignored her, his focus entirely on the road ahead. For the next few minutes, silence stretched between them, interrupted only by the low hum of the McLaren's engine and the occasional pop of Vanessa's gum. Finally, she broke the quiet, her voice carrying a trace of genuine curiosity. Alexander's eyes didn't leave the road. "What's your price?" he asked flatly. Vanessa blinked, momentarily thrown off by the bluntness of his question. Then she leaned closer, her tone playful but with an edge. "Depends," she said slowly, letting the word hang in the air. "What exactly are you paying for?" "I'm not interested in your body," he said, his voice cold and matter-of-fact. "I'm renting your time." Vanessa leaned back, her amusement giving way to a flicker of confusion. "Renting my time," she repeated, drawing out the words like they were foreign. "What the hell does that even mean?" Alexander's gaze remained fixed on the horizon. "It means I'll pay you to stay with me, no strings attached, no extracurricular activities required, just your time." For a moment Vanessa didn't know how to respond. Her usual sharp wit seemed to fail her as she processed his words. "You're serious?" she said finally, her voice tinged with disbelief. "You're going to pay me to sit here and, what, keep you company?" "Yes," Alexander said simply. Vanessa laughed, the sound sharp and incredulous. "Wow, and here I thought I'd heard it all." She shook her head, blowing another bubble. "All right, fine. Let's say I'm interested. What's in it for you?" Alexander's grip on the wheel tightened. His next words came out low and measured. "That's not your concern." Vanessa studied him for a long moment, her sharp eyes searching his profile for any hint of an ulterior motive. But his expression remained unreadable, a mask of calm determination. Finally, she shrugged. "All right, boss," she said, her tone light but with a hint of resignation. "Your money, your rules." The car fell silent again as they sped through the city streets, the glow of Christmas lights casting fleeting reflections on the windshield. Vanessa turned her attention to the window, watching the world blur past, while Alexander's thoughts churned like a storm. The arrival minutes later, they arrived at their destination. The sprawling Whitmore estate loomed ahead, its grand gates opening slowly to reveal a winding driveway lined with perfectly trimmed hedges and twinkling holiday lights. The mansion itself was a vision of opulence, its stone facade glowing warmly against the cold winter night. Vanessa's jaw tightened as she took in the sight. "Well, aren't you full of surprises?" she muttered under her breath. Alexander didn't respond. He pulled the car to a smooth stop in front of the grand entrance and stepped out, moving with the confidence of a man accustomed to command. He walked around to the passenger side and opened the door for her. "Get out," he said simply. Vanessa arched an eyebrow, but complied, stepping out of the car with the practiced grace of someone used to drawing attention. Her heels clicked against the polished stone driveway as she followed Alexander toward the massive front doors. Just before they reached the entrance, he stopped abruptly and turned to her. "We're going through the service entrance," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Vanessa blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" she said, crossing her arms. "You heard me?" Alexander said firmly. His eyes swept over her outfit, a short skirt, a fitted top, and those sky-high heels, and his expression hardened. "My daughters can't see you like this." Vanessa bristled, her defiance flaring to the surface. "Oh, so now I'm not good enough to walk through your fancy front door?" Alexander didn't respond. He simply turned on his heel and began walking toward a smaller side entrance. After a moment's hesitation, Vanessa followed, muttering under her breath, "Unbelievable." They entered through a modest doorway that led into the estate's expansive kitchen. The air was warm and filled with the comforting aroma of baked goods and simmering spices. A woman in her 60s, wearing a pristine apron, looked up from a cutting board as they entered. Her eyes lingered on Alexander with a mixture of respect and familiarity before shifting to Vanessa. Vanessa forced a polite smile. "Good evening," she said, her voice carefully measured. The older woman nodded but said nothing. Before Vanessa could say anything else, Alexander spoke, his tone firm. "You don't talk to the staff. It's not part of the arrangement." Vanessa's smile vanished, replaced by a glare. "Excuse me?" Alexander ignored her and gestured toward a staircase leading down to a small private suite. "Change your clothes. You have 5 minutes." Vanessa crossed her arms, her defiance returning full force. "And what if I don't feel like it?" Alexander's gaze locked onto hers, his eyes steely and unyielding. Then the deal's off. For a moment, the two of them stood in a silent standoff. Then, with a huff of frustration, Vanessa turned and marched down the stairs. The suite was surprisingly elegant for what Vanessa assumed was meant to be a servant's quarters. The room was modest compared to the grandeur of the estate above, but still far beyond what she was accustomed to. Against the wall was an open wardrobe filled with neatly arranged clothes, dresses, blouses, skirts, all clearly expensive and in impeccable condition. A faint scent of lavender and a high-end perfume lingered in the air, adding an almost haunting touch of sophistication. Vanessa ran her fingers along the delicate fabrics, her mind racing. What kind of game is this guy playing, she wondered, her frustration mingling with a flicker of unease. For all his wealth and arrogance, Alexander didn't seem like the type to play harmless games. And yet, here she was, standing in a stranger's mansion, about to step into someone else's life. She glanced at the mirror on the far wall, catching her own reflection. Her bold red lipstick, her heavily lined eyes, her short skirt, they all felt like armor, pieces of a persona she'd spent years perfecting. She hesitated, her hand lingering over a navy blue dress that practically screamed class and refinement. With a sharp inhale, she pulled it off the hanger. Minutes later, Vanessa stood before the mirror again, transformed. The dress fit her perfectly, hugging her figure in a way that was elegant rather than provocative. Her face, now free of its heavy makeup, revealed a softer, almost vulnerable version of herself. For the first time in years, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. A knock at the door startled her. Alexander's voice was firm, authoritative. "Time's up. Let's go." Vanessa rolled her eyes but opened the door, stepping into the hallway. She was greeted by Alexander's sharp gaze, which flickered briefly with something she couldn't quite identify. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. "You clean up well," he said, his tone neutral, but laced with something deeper. "Follow me." "Gee, thanks," Vanessa muttered under her breath, as she followed him back up the stairs. The main hall of the mansion was breathtaking, with its high ceilings, glittering chandeliers, and a massive Christmas tree adorned with twinkling lights and delicate ornaments. The scent of pine mingled with the warmth of a roaring fireplace, creating a picture-perfect holiday atmosphere. For a moment, Vanessa was so taken aback by the sheer opulence of it all that she almost forgot where she was. Almost. In the center of the room, 3 small girls were playing on a plush rug, their laughter filling the air. They were identical in every way, same golden curls, same bright, curious eyes. Vanessa froze, her breath catching in her throat. Alexander stepped forward, his expression softening as he addressed the children. "Girls," he called, his voice warm but commanding. "Come here." The 3 little heads turned toward him, and their faces lit up with joy. In an instant, they were on their feet, running toward him with arms outstretched. "Daddy!" they cried in unison. Vanessa watched as they threw themselves into Alexander's arms, their giggles echoing through the grand hall. For a brief moment, she saw a side of him she hadn't expected, a tenderness that was almost disarming. But then the girls noticed her. One by one, they turned their wide, curious eyes toward Vanessa. There was a moment of silence, and then, as if on cue, they erupted into excited squeals. "Mama! one of them shouted, running toward Vanessa with outstretched arms. The word hit Vanessa like a thunderclap. She took a step back, her hands instinctively going up as if to shield herself. "Wait, no," she began, but the little girl was already clinging to her leg. "Mama, you came back," another one cried, joining her sister in hugging Vanessa tightly. "We missed you." Vanessa looked up at Alexander, panic flashing in her eyes. "What the hell is this?" she hissed, her voice low but sharp. "They think you're their mother," Alexander said simply, his expression unreadable. "Well, I'm not," Vanessa shot back, trying to extricate herself from the children's grips without hurting their feelings. Alexander's gaze darkened. "Not tonight, you're not," he said firmly. "But as far as they're concerned, you are. And you'll play along." Vanessa opened her mouth to protest, but the third little girl had already wrapped her arms around her waist, looking up at her with wide, tear-filled eyes. "Are you staying this time, Mama?" she asked softly. "You won't leave again, will you?" The child's voice cracked something inside Vanessa. She looked down at the 3 pairs of pleading eyes and felt her resistance falter. She began, but the words caught in her throat. Alexander stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low murmur. "They've been through enough. Don't make it worse." Vanessa glared at him, but the weight of the children's emotions was too much to ignore. With a reluctant sigh, she knelt down, placing a hand gently on the shoulder of the nearest girl. "I'm here," she said softly, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. "I'm not going anywhere." The girls erupted into cheers, throwing their arms around her in a group hug that nearly knocked her off balance. Vanessa glanced up at Alexander, her eyes blazing with barely restrained fury. He met her gaze with a calm, almost smug expression, as if daring her to break the illusion. As the evening wore on, Vanessa found herself swept into the rhythm of the household. The children clung to her like she was their lifeline, their laughter and chatter filling the spaces where her protests might have been. Despite her initial reluctance, she couldn't deny the warmth that crept into her chest every time one of them called her Mama. But then she noticed something odd. The youngest of the 3, Melanie, if she'd heard correctly, was unusually quiet. Her cheeks were flushed, and she seemed to lean heavily on her sisters for support. Vanessa knelt beside her, placing a hand on her forehead. Her skin was burning to the touch. "Alexander!" she called, her voice sharper than she'd intended. He appeared almost immediately, his expression shifting from calm to concerned as he took in the scene. "What's wrong?" "She's got a fever," Vanessa said, her voice tinged with urgency. "A bad one." Alexander crouched beside her, pressing the back of his hand to Melanie's forehead. His jaw tightened. "I'll call the doctor," he said, pulling out his phone. "No," Melanie whispered, her voice faint but insistent. "I just want Mama." Vanessa froze. The girl's tiny hand reached for hers, clutching it with surprising strength. "Please," Melanie murmured, her eyes shining with trust. For a moment Vanessa didn't know what to do. She looked at Alexander, who simply nodded, his expression softening. Taking a deep breath, Vanessa scooped the girl into her arms. "It's okay," she said softly, brushing a strand of hair from Melanie's face. "I'm here." Melanie nestled against her, and for the first time in years, Vanessa felt something she couldn't quite name, a sense of purpose, perhaps, or a glimpse of the woman she could have been if life had taken a different turn. As she held the little girl close, she whispered words she hadn't planned, words that came from somewhere deep and unfamiliar. "I'll take care of you." I promise. Vanessa stayed by Melanie's side for hours, sitting on the edge of an oversized velvet armchair in one of the mansion's many living rooms. The little girl's breathing was soft and even, her tiny hand curled around Vanessa's thumb like it was her lifeline. The warmth radiating from her feverish body seeped into Vanessa's skin, grounding her in a way she hadn't felt in years. Alexander had stepped out of the room to make calls, presumably to a doctor, but Vanessa barely noticed his absence. Her attention was fixed entirely on Melanie. She gently adjusted the blanket tucked around the child and reached for a cool, damp cloth from the tray one of the house staff had brought her. As she pressed the cloth to Melanie's flushed forehead, a voice broke the silence. "You're good at this," Vanessa startled, looking up to find Alexander standing in the doorway. His voice was softer than she expected, his usual steeliness replaced by something almost admiring. He held a steaming cup of tea in his hand, which he extended toward her. She hesitated before taking it, her fingers brushing against his briefly. "Thanks," she muttered, her voice gruff, as if trying to downplay the tenderness of the moment. Alexander didn't move. He stood there, watching her with an intensity that made her shift uncomfortably in her seat. "What?" she snapped, not looking up from Melanie. "You remind me of her," he said simply. Vanessa stiffened. "Here we go again," she muttered, more to herself than to him. She glanced at him, her expression guarded. "Look, I don't know what kind of twisted fantasy this is, but I'm not her. I don't know her, and I sure as hell don't want to pretend to be her." Alexander's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "I'm not asking you to be her," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "I'm asking you to help me give these girls some stability, even if it's just for a little while." Vanessa let out a humorless laugh. "Stability?" she echoed. "You picked me up off the street, Alexander. I'm the last person who should be playing house in your Christmas fairy tale." "Maybe," he admitted, his gaze unwavering. "But you're here now. And whether you realize it or not, you're already making a difference." Vanessa opened her mouth to argue, but the words died in her throat as Melanie stirred against her. The little girl murmured something incoherent, her small face scrunching in discomfort. Without thinking, Vanessa began to hum softly, a tune she couldn't even remember where she'd learned, and Melanie settled again. Alexander watched the scene unfold, his expression unreadable. "You have no idea how much they need you," he said quietly, almost to himself. Then he turned and left the room, leaving Vanessa alone with her thoughts. By the time Melanie's fever broke, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale golden light across the room. Vanessa had barely slept, her body stiff from sitting in the same position for hours, but she didn't care. When Melanie finally opened her eyes and smiled weakly at her, it felt like she'd climbed a mountain and reached the summit. "Morning, kiddo," Vanessa said softly, brushing a stray curl from the little girl's face. Melanie blinked up at her, her voice still faint. "Are you staying, Mama?" Vanessa froze, her chest tightening. She opened her mouth, unsure of what to say, but before she could respond, the other two girls came bounding into the room. "Mama," they cried in unison, their identical faces lighting up with joy. "It's Christmas morning." Vanessa blinked. "Christmas? Already?" She glanced at the clock on the ornate mantel and realized they were right. It was Christmas morning. She looked at Melanie, who had pushed herself upright and was now smiling shyly at her sisters. Alexander appeared in the doorway, his presence commanding as always. "Breakfast is ready," he announced, his voice softer than usual. His gaze lingered on Vanessa, who was still holding Melanie's hand. "Why don't you join us?" Vanessa hesitated, torn between the impulse to run and the strange, growing attachment she felt to these children. But the sight of their hopeful faces was too much to resist. With a resigned sigh, she stood, lifting Melanie into her arms. "All right," she said gruffly, "let's go." The dining room was a picture of holiday perfection. A massive table was laden with every breakfast dish imaginable: pancakes, scrambled eggs, fruit, pastries, and more. The girls squealed with delight as they climbed into their seats, their eyes wide with excitement. Vanessa placed Melanie gently in a chair before taking a seat herself. She felt out of place amid the opulence, but the warmth in the room, the laughter of the children, the crackling of the fireplace, made it easier to ignore. Alexander sat at the head of the table, his sharp features softened by the glow of the Christmas lights. He poured himself a cup of coffee before glancing at Vanessa. "Do you celebrate Christmas?" he asked casually. She shrugged, cutting into a stack of pancakes. "Not really. Holidays don't mean much when you're alone." The girls gasped in unison, their faces filled with disbelief. "You don't celebrate Christmas, Mama?" one of them asked, her voice filled with genuine concern. Vanessa froze, her fork hovering in midair. She glanced at Alexander, who was watching her with a faint smirk, clearly enjoying her discomfort. "Well," she said slowly, searching for the right words, "I guess. Maybe I just haven't had a reason to." The girls exchanged looks, their little faces lighting up with determination. "We'll show you how to celebrate, Mama," one of them declared, and the others nodded enthusiastically. Vanessa couldn't help but smile. "All right, kids," she said, leaning back in her chair. "Show me what you've got." After breakfast, the day passed in a blur of activity. The girls dragged Vanessa from one festive activity to another, decorating cookies, opening presents, even singing Christmas carols. Despite her initial reluctance, Vanessa found herself laughing and smiling more than she had in years. As night fell and the children were tucked into bed, Vanessa found herself alone in the sitting room, staring out the window at the snow-covered grounds. The weight of the day's events pressed down on her, and she struggled to make sense of the emotions swirling inside her. "You did good today." She turned to see Alexander standing in the doorway, his hands in his pockets. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, and for once there was no trace of the usual tension between them. Vanessa sighed, turning back to the window. "Don't get used to it," she muttered, though her tone lacked its usual bite. Alexander stepped closer, his gaze steady. "They need someone like you," he said simply, "and maybe you need them too." Vanessa didn't respond. She couldn't, because deep down she knew he might be right. Alexander, visibly shaken, grabbed his phone and began dialing frantically. "I'll call the doctor," he announced, his fingers trembling as they moved over the screen. The phone rang only once before disconnecting, a clear signal that the doctor's phone was off, likely due to the Christmas holiday. Alexander stared at the device helplessly, frustration flickering in his eyes. Vanessa, watching him closely, saw his veneer of control begin to crack. She stepped forward with a calm confidence that surprised even herself. "Don't panic," she said, her voice steady but warm, accompanied by a faint smile. "It's common for kids to get sick easily. My grandmother taught me what to do in these cases. I used to get sick all the time as a child." Her words cut through Alexander's growing anxiety. He looked up at her, a mixture of skepticism and hope in his expression. "Are you sure, Madeline?" he asked, once again clinging to the name that tied her to the past. Vanessa nodded, taking a deep breath. Her voice reflected the calm determination she was beginning to rediscover within herself. "Do you have any children's fever medication in the house?" "Yes," Alexander replied almost immediately, his relief palpable. "Then bring it right away," Vanessa said, her tone firm and commanding, a stark contrast to her earlier hesitance. "But first, help me move her to her bed. I'll take care of the fever just like my grandmother used to do for me." Alexander didn't waste a second. Scooping Melanie into his arms with the care of a deeply concerned father, he followed Vanessa's lead. The other two girls trailed closely behind as they made their way to the children's shared bedroom. Alexander gently placed Melanie on one of the small, neatly made beds, tucking her under the blankets with careful precision, before hurrying off to fetch the medication. In moments of urgency, tenderness shines brightest. It's in those moments that the soul reveals its purest light. Alexander returned minutes later, holding a bottle of children's fever medicine and a glass of water. Vanessa stood, her expression resolute, as she took both items from him. Kneeling beside Melanie, her voice softened into a comforting melody. "Mommy's here, sweetheart. Drink this, and you'll feel better soon." She helped Melanie drink the medication, her movements patient and deliberate, ensuring the child swallowed without difficulty. Melanie's bright, trusting eyes never left Vanessa's face, as if her mere presence was a balm for her discomfort. When the task was done, Vanessa glanced up at Alexander, who was standing nearby watching her with a look of quiet awe. "I need warm water and towels from the kitchen," she said, her tone calm but firm. "I'll be right back. Trust me." Alexander gave a silent nod and stepped aside, allowing Vanessa to leave the room. A few minutes later, she returned with the requested items and a serene concentration that seemed to settle the room's tension. Sitting beside Melanie, she dipped a towel into the warm water, wringing it out with practiced ease before placing it gently on the child's forehead. "My grandmother was good at this," she said, a faint smile curving her lips. "She taught me where the fever likes to hide in the body." As she spoke, she alternated between placing the cool, damp towels on Melanie's wrists, neck, and forehead. Her movements were methodical, almost soothing in their rhythm. Nearby, Eloise, one of the other girls, had climbed onto the bed and was now playing with Vanessa's hair, her tiny fingers tangling themselves in the loose strands. "Eloise, leave Mommy alone," Alexander said gently but firmly, his voice carrying a note of authority. Vanessa, however, shook her head, her smile softening as she looked at the child. "It's fine, Alexander," she said warmly. "She's making me very happy." Alexander fell silent, a look of quiet satisfaction and gratitude softening his normally stern features. As he observed the scene before him, he seemed momentarily lost in thought. The third girl, Teresa, approached Vanessa cautiously and wrapped her small arms around her waist. She rested her head on Vanessa's lap and whispered in a voice so pure it tugged at Vanessa's heart. "Thank you for coming back, Mommy. Daddy said you went on a trip a long time ago." Vanessa blinked, her throat tightening. She forced a gentle smile and replied softly, "I never really left, sweetheart. The things we love always stay with us." Alexander stepped closer and placed a hand gently on Teresa's shoulder. "You heard, Mommy," he said, his voice steady but tender. "Even when you can't see her, she's always with you." The room grew quiet, the air thick with emotions too complex for words. Love, in its purest form, is unbreakable. It transcends time and space, leaving an invisible thread that binds souls together. The room remained calm as Melanie stirred, her small face now free of the fever's flush. She opened her eyes, her gaze soft, but filled with a serene warmth that only children seem to possess. "Mommy," she murmured, her voice weak but clear, "I feel better now." Vanessa and Alexander, who had retreated to a corner of the room, exchanged a look of profound relief. A faint, grateful smile touched Melanie's lips before she drifted back to sleep. Quietly, Alexander motioned for Vanessa to step outside. They moved to the hallway, leaving the room in a silence that felt more peaceful than tense. Alexander stood with his hands in his pockets, his expression heavy with unspoken thoughts. "She's the most sensitive of the three," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every Christmas Eve, it's the same. It's like her heart and body rebel together. She's the one who misses her mother the most." Vanessa looked down, her chest tightening. Something about the vulnerability of the children, especially Melanie, had touched a part of her she hadn't realized was still alive. Finally, she asked the question that had been gnawing at her since she'd arrived. "What do you expect from me in this rented mother contract?" Her voice was steady, but her unease was evident. Alexander met her gaze, his expression resolute. "I expect you to share this Christmas with the girls as if you were their mother," he said bluntly. "That's all. At dawn, you're free to leave." Vanessa stared at him, incredulous. "And what do you plan to tell them when I'm gone?" she asked, her tone sharper than she intended. Alexander swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. "I'll tell them the truth," he said after a pause, his voice heavy with regret. "That Mommy had to go on another trip and will come back someday." Vanessa turned away, her emotions swirling. The thought of leaving the girls, especially Melanie, filled her with an unexpected ache. "What am I doing here?" she wondered. Yet, deep inside, another thought surfaced, quiet but insistent. Sometimes, even a fleeting moment of love can leave a mark that lasts forever. Later that evening, the family gathered around a dining table that looked as though it had been plucked from a storybook. A white tablecloth embroidered with golden snowflakes draped elegantly across the surface, while candles flickered warmly in crystal holders. The centerpiece was a magnificent roast surrounded by an array of sides that glistened under the soft light. The three girls sat at the table, their faces glowing with excitement, their voices filling the air with giggles and chatter. Vanessa found herself seated between Alexander and the children. Though she still felt like an outsider in this picture-perfect scene, the warmth of the moment began to seep into her guarded heart. As the meal progressed, Teresa, the boldest of the three, turned her sparkling eyes toward Vanessa. "Mama, sing for us!" she exclaimed suddenly, her small hands clapping in anticipation. Vanessa froze, her fork pausing midway to her mouth. "Sing?" she echoed, blinking at the unexpected request. "Yes," Eloise chimed in, her curls bouncing as she nodded enthusiastically. "Daddy always says you used to sing beautifully." Vanessa turned her head sharply toward Alexander, who had gone noticeably pale. His fork slipped from his hand, clattering against his plate. He glanced at Vanessa, his expression a mixture of alarm and embarrassment. "I think Mommy's tired," Alexander said quickly, his tone forced as he attempted to steer the conversation away. "Maybe another time." Vanessa raised a hand, cutting him off. "Let me sing for them," she said, her voice steady, but laced with something deeper, an unspoken challenge. Alexander stared at her, stunned, as if trying to decipher her intentions. But before he could protest further, Vanessa stood. Her movements were deliberate, her eyes meeting each of the girls' expectant gazes. She closed her eyes briefly, inhaling deeply as though summoning something long buried. And then, in the stillness of the room, her voice broke forth, a soft, pure melody that wrapped around them like a warm embrace. The song was a Christmas carol, simple yet hauntingly beautiful. Each note seemed to carry not only the spirit of the season, but also a raw vulnerability that resonated with everyone in the room. The girls abandoned their seats almost immediately, rushing to her side. They clung to her dress, their small hands grasping at the fabric as they gazed up at her in awe. Vanessa continued singing, her voice growing steadier, stronger. Alexander sat motionless, his jaw slack. In all the years since Madeline had passed, he had never heard another voice that stirred his soul the way hers had. Yet now, Vanessa's voice, different yet eerily similar, was doing just that. His mind raced with questions, but they were drowned out by the overwhelming emotion welling up inside him. As the song ended, Vanessa knelt to embrace the girls, their arms wrapping around her in an unbreakable grip. "You sing just like Mommy used to," Teresa exclaimed, her voice filled with innocent wonder. Vanessa smiled, her heart tightening at the words. She kissed each of their foreheads, whispering, "Thank you, my loves. You make me brave enough to sing." The rest of the evening unfolded like a dream. Vanessa played games with the girls, teaching them silly songs her grandmother had once sung to her. They twirled and danced around the room, their laughter echoing off the grand walls. Even Alexander, who initially remained on the sidelines, found himself drawn into their joy. He helped Vanessa teach the girls a simple waltz, his strong hands guiding their tiny ones as they moved in clumsy circles around the room. For Alexander, the night was both a blessing and a torment. Watching Vanessa interact with his daughters, watching her bring life back into their eyes, stirred emotions he had long suppressed. He couldn't deny the magnetism she exuded, the way she seemed to fill the void Madeleine had left behind. Yet it terrified him, too. How could she be so much like her? As the clock struck midnight, the energy of the evening began to wane. The girls, exhausted from the excitement, clung to Vanessa as she tucked them into bed. She hummed softly to them, stroking their curls until their eyes fluttered shut. Alexander watched from the doorway, his heart caught in his throat. He had never seen his daughters look so peaceful. When Vanessa finally stepped out of the room, closing the door quietly behind her, she found him waiting. "Thank you," he said, his voice low but earnest. "For everything tonight." Vanessa offered him a faint smile, though her eyes betrayed a deeper turmoil. "They're a wonderful girl," she said softly. "You're lucky to have them." Alexander nodded, but his gaze lingered on her. "You're part of this now, you know," he said after a pause. "They've already claimed you." Vanessa looked away, her jaw tightening. "I'm not who they think I am," she said quietly, "and tomorrow when I'm gone, they'll realize that." Alexander stepped closer, his brow furrowing. "You don't have to go," he said, his voice laced with something she couldn't quite place. "Stay. Be with them." Vanessa turned to him, her expression hardening. "Don't," she said firmly. "Don't make this harder than it already is." Alexander searched her eyes, but she refused to let him in. Finally he nodded, his shoulders sagging slightly. "I'll drive you," he offered. Vanessa shook her head. "Number, stay with them. I'll call a cab." As Vanessa made her way to the grand entrance, her movements slow and deliberate, her gaze fell on a small table near the wall. It was decorated with a lace runner and a single lamp, its soft light casting a glow over a silver-framed photograph. She paused, her heart inexplicably quickening. Stepping closer, she reached for the frame. Her breath caught as her eyes locked onto the image. It was a black and white portrait of a young woman, her features strikingly familiar. Her fingers trembled as she picked up the frame. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It can't be." Behind her, Alexander approached cautiously, noticing the change in her demeanor. "Vanessa?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. "Is something wrong?" She turned to him, the photograph clutched tightly in her hands. Her eyes were wide, shimmering with unshed tears. "Who is this woman?" she demanded, her voice shaking. Alexander frowned, confused by her reaction. "That's Madeline's mother," he replied, his tone gentle but puzzled. Vanessa's grip on the frame tightened, her knuckles white. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Finally, a choked sob escaped her. "She's my mother, too," she said, her voice breaking. "That's my mother." Alexander's expression shifted from confusion to shock. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Vanessa's tears flowed freely now, her shoulders trembling. "My grandmother told me my mother died, giving birth to me," she said through sobs. "She said I had no one, but this picture, it's her. I know it." Alexander stared at her, his mind racing. "Are you saying you and Madeline were twins?" Vanessa nodded, her voice trembling. "We were separated. I don't know how, but she's my sister." Alexander stood frozen, the weight of Vanessa's words crashing over him like a tidal wave. "Twins," he echoed, his voice distant, as though he were trying to grasp an impossible truth. "How could that be? How could none of us have known?" Vanessa clutched the photograph tightly, her fingers trembling. Her gaze darted between the image and Alexander, searching for answers she knew he couldn't provide. "My grandmother always said my mother was alone when she gave birth," Vanessa murmured, her voice cracking. "She told me my father had abandoned her, and by the time my grandmother arrived, my mother was gone, and so was everyone else who might have helped." Alexander's brow furrowed, his thoughts racing. "Madeline grew up with her adoptive parents," he said, his tone slow and measured, as he pieced the fragments together. "She never spoke about her birth mother. She thought they were her only family." Vanessa pressed a hand to her chest, her breaths coming shallow and uneven. "All these years," she whispered, tears spilling freely. "I thought I was alone." Alexander reached out hesitantly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone," he said softly, his voice steady, despite the turmoil raging within him. "You never were, and you're not now." Vanessa sank into a nearby chair, her body trembling as the weight of the revelation bore down on her. Alexander moved to sit across from her, his expression a mixture of shock and determination. "How could something like this happen?" Vanessa asked, her voice hollow. "How could I have been separated from my sister, from the family I never knew I had?" Alexander ran a hand through his hair, his mind still struggling to comprehend the enormity of what he'd just learned. "There must be more to the story," he said finally, "something neither of us knows." Vanessa looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed but resolute. "Then we need to find out," she said firmly. "I need to know the truth, for me and for Madeline." Alexander nodded, his own resolve solidifying. "We will," he promised. "But right now, the girls need you." At the mention of the children, Vanessa's expression softened. She thought of Melanie's feverish plea for her mommy, of Teresa's fearless embrace, of Eloise's joyful laughter. They weren't just Madeleine's daughters anymore. In her heart, they had become part of her too. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the mansion's grand windows, illuminating the remnants of the previous night's festivities. The Christmas tree still twinkled with lights, its branches adorned with ornaments that sparkled like tiny stars. Vanessa awoke to the sound of soft giggles. Opening her eyes, she found herself surrounded by the three girls, their faces lit with innocent mischief. "Good morning, Mama," Teresa declared, climbing onto the edge of the bed. Vanessa smiled sleepily, reaching out to ruffle the girls' curls. "Good morning, my loves," she said, her voice warm. Eloise clambered up beside her, holding a small box wrapped in shiny red paper. "We have a present for you," she exclaimed, her excitement barely contained. Vanessa sat up, her heart swelling as she took the box. She carefully unwrapped the paper, revealing a delicate silver bracelet with 3 tiny charms, a heart, a star, and a flower. Tears welled in her eyes as she held it up. "Do you like it, Mama?" Melanie asked shyly, her voice still soft from the remnants of her fever. Vanessa nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She pulled the girls into a hug, holding them close, as tears slid down her cheeks. From the doorway, Alexander watched silently, his arms crossed over his chest. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope. Later that day, Vanessa found herself standing on the balcony, overlooking the snowy grounds of the estate. She leaned against the railing, her thoughts a tangled web of emotions. The warmth of the children's love filled her with a sense of belonging she hadn't felt in years, but the enormity of her past and the unresolved questions about her connection to Madeline loomed like shadows over her. Alexander joined her, his footsteps soft on the marble floor. He stood beside her, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "They adore you," he said quietly, breaking the silence. "You've given them something I couldn't." Vanessa turned to him, her expression conflicted. "They think I'm their mother," she said. "What happens when they realize I'm not?" Alexander looked at her, his eyes filled with an intensity that took her breath away. "You're more than just a stand-in," he said. "You're part of this family now, whether you planned it or not." Vanessa's heart ached at his words. She wanted to believe him, but the weight of her past and the uncertainty of the future held her back. "I don't know how to be what they need," she admitted. "I don't even know who I am anymore." Alexander reached out, his hand brushing against hers. "You're the woman who stayed up all night to care for Melanie," he said. "The woman who sang to my daughters and made them feel whole again. That's who you are." As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the estate, Alexander made a decision. He led Vanessa into the sitting room, where the girls were busy playing with their new toys. "Girls," he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion, "I have something important to ask." The children looked up, their eyes sparkling with curiosity. Vanessa frowned, glancing at him uncertainly. Alexander turned to her, his expression resolute. "Vanessa," he said, his voice soft but firm, "will you stay? Not just for Christmas, but for good. Be part of our family. Be their mother." Vanessa's breath caught, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced at the girls, who were watching her with wide, hopeful eyes, and then back at Alexander. She began, but the words faltered. Eloise ran to her, grabbing her hand. "Say yes, Mama," she pleaded. Vanessa knelt, pulling the child into her arms. She looked at Alexander, her eyes glistening with tears. "You're sure?" she asked, her voice trembling. You're really sure about this? Alexander stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. I've never been more sure of anything, he said. You belong here, Vanessa. With us. Vanessa closed her eyes, letting his words wash over her. When she opened them, she smiled through her tears. Yes, she whispered. I'll stay. The room erupted with joy as the girls cheered and hugged her tightly. Alexander reached for her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. In that moment, the family they had both longed for but never dared to hope for began to take shape. That evening, the family gathered once more around the glowing fireplace. The girls, now fully at ease, snuggled beside Vanessa, their laughter filling the room. Alexander watched them, his heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and hope. Vanessa, too, felt a peace she hadn't known in years, one that came not from running, but from finally belonging. As the clock neared midnight, Vanessa glanced at Alexander, her eyes reflecting a quiet determination. I want to know more about Madeline, she said softly. About my sister. Alexander nodded. We'll find out together, he promised, his hand resting over hers. In the days that followed, the search for answers began, but so too did the weaving of a new family. Vanessa embraced her role, not just as the girls' caregiver, but as someone who could honor Madeline's memory by loving them wholeheartedly. Alexander, for the first time in years, allowed himself to believe in second chances. The past had left its scars, but it also carried lessons and unexpected blessings. Vanessa's journey, marked by loss and rediscovery, had brought her to a place she never thought possible. A home, a family, and the hope of healing. As snow fell gently outside, Vanessa leaned into Alexander's shoulder, the warmth of the girls nestled beside them. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. Together they had found not just a miracle, but the courage to build something beautiful from the fragments of the past. And in the quiet glow of that Christmas night, they knew this was only the beginning.